Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. Today, it's Friday, March 14, and on episode 19 of the show, we're happy to welcome back Andrew Nachemson, former managing editor of Frontier and freelance journalist. We'll discuss revolutionary politics and conflict in Mon State. But before we do, it's been a big news week in Myanmar, and we're going to bring you some of the major developments that have happened in the business sector this week. Now, that's not to downplay all of the clashes, the conflicts, the airstrikes, and the many innocent people that have been killed since our last episode. With that in mind, let's get into it. This podcast comes at the crest of a wave of international business agreements between the Myanmar military regime, Myanmar crony companies, and companies and governments in Russia, Belarus, and the People's Republic of China. On March 6, a total of 13 bilateral documents were signed between Myanmar and Belarusian entities during the State Administration Council's visit to that country. They included agreements leading to producing milk powder and tractors in Myanmar and exporting seafood to Belarus. Memorandums of understanding were also signed between higher education institutions in both countries. The agreements in Belarus came after coup leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, visited Russia last week, where he sat down with President Vladimir Putin, a fellow target of the International Criminal Court. One of their topics of conversation was Russian investment. And then, this Tuesday, Deputy Commander-in-Chief General So Win signalled the military was open to Russian and Belarusian investment in the moribund and controversial Dawei Special Economic Zone, which had drawn interest by both Thailand and Japan in years past, but has long laid dormant. And then, just days before China's Special Envoy for Asian Affairs, Deng Xijun, visited Naypyidaw on Tuesday, Myanmar Now reported that the military has plans to rent out land through the Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited Company, or MEHL, to a Chinese electric vehicle EV manufacturer. MEHL is one of two giant military conglomerates with interests right across the national economy, and will lease the land to BYD, which is an industry-leading Chinese electric vehicle automaker. BYD would manufacture EVs in Bogor region using the semi-knockdown system that companies like Suzuki pioneered in Myanmar during the previous civilian administration. A business source has apparently confirmed the deal, and Min Aung Hlaing actually visited the BYD headquarters in Shenzhen during a trip to China in November 2023. An investment by BYD would be a boon to the military regime from a technological and reputational perspective, and it would allow military leaders to influence or control more future vital industries, not to mention the benefits of long-term factory rent flowing from the Chinese company right into the general's pockets. Domestically produced EVs of any kind, we have to say, would also benefit the worsening air quality in the country's big cities. But business hasn't all gone the military's way this week, with fresh sanctions being announced by two foreign countries. On March 7, Canada announced it would be sanctioning the Myanmar Defence Ministry and key military individuals in response to what it says are human rights violations, entrenched violence, repression, and the overall worsening crisis in Myanmar. The Canadian sanctions extend to those controlled by the sanctioned entities, meaning that they also apply to things like the Directorate of Public Relations and Psychological Warfare, which sounds pretty intense, but actually operates the television channels and the media in Myanmar. Then this week, Switzerland sanctioned the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, or MOGE, which is in line with the European Union's sanctions of the same entity announced last month. Switzerland's hesitance in sanctioning MOGE was, according to activist group Justice for Myanmar, to avoid the need to modify Swiss law to implement a derogation in EU sanctions for the decommissioning of oil and gas fields. End quote. For more details on these technical sanctions, go to the show notes. In another blow to military-aligned business, the Arakan Army, or the AA, has begun expropriating private property belonging to people accused of having ties to the military in Rakhine State. This includes major tycoons like Zhao Dang, who apparently had millions of US dollars worth of assets confiscated by the AA in and around Dawngup and Maungdaw. Jiao Daun owns ferries in the region and is financially invested in the development of the Jiaopyu Special Economic Zone, along with a Chinese state-owned company. For his part, Jiao Daun has denied being allied with the military or its proxies. The AA has also seized high-end hotels in the beach resort town of Ngapali and closed off houses there connected to cronies and military families. This news came as airstrikes and clashes around Sittwe and Jiaopyu continued. While no fighting this week has yet been reported inside either town proper, it is getting closer and closer to Jiaopyu. There are movement restrictions inside both towns, and one Jiaopyu resident this week said the local military light infantry battalion base is extorting civilians and demanding 400,000 Myanmar Jat, or about US $190, per person to access the airport through the town. Now, this was just the tip of the iceberg of everything that happened in Myanmar this week. If you want more daily updates on everything happening in Myanmar with English language context and analysis, and even translations of Myanmar local media, social media posts, look no further than a Frontier Myanmar membership. You can have all this and more for less than the price of a cup of coffee every week. Go to frontiermyanmar.net/membership or email members@frontiermyanmar.net to get involved. Now, time to bring in our guest for this episode, Andrew Nachemson. He's written a feature story being published by Frontier Myanmar next week about the split in the new Mon State Party, or NMSP. This split occurred on Mon National Day in February 2024, last year, and the split led to two separate tracks within the NMSP: those who continue to abide by the nationwide ceasefire agreement with the military, which is the most recent of three ceasefires that the NMSP has signed with the military over time, the first of which was in 1995, and those who refuse to do so. This newer breakaway group call themselves the NMSP-AD, the AD standing for Anti Dictatorship. At the time of the split, Mon scholar Dr. Pinar Mon said to the Irrawaddy, "One group wants to establish federalism by fighting, and the other wants to establish federalism via political dialogue. Their political objectives are the same, and they only need to avoid confrontation with each other." End quote. Well, it's been a year now since that split, and the NMSP has managed to avoid public confrontations between its factions. In December last year, the NMSP-AD met with other, much more active post-coup Mon resistance groups and agreed with them to band together to establish a unified Mon army opposing the Myanmar military. Then the groups formed a new task force in January to expedite strengthening that cooperation. As this situation develops, the NMSP-AD has let a foreign journalist into their territory to report on the political split and the conflict environment in Mon State. That journalist was Andy. Hello, Andy.
Hey, Luke. Thanks for having me back on the program.
Hey, you keep going on these important trips and I'll keep begging you to come back. You've filed reports from Karen and Karenni states in the last year or so, and now you're just back from Mon State. What questions did you have? What led you to the NMSP-AD areas?
Yeah, I think one thing that particularly drew me there was just how little reporting there had been from Mon State, and the fact that nobody, I think nobody outside of the Mon community, is what I was told, has done a reporting trip with the NMSP or this breakaway faction, the NMSP-AD, since the coup. You know, of course, a lot of people have gone to Karenni State. A lot of people have embedded with the KNU. So I thought this was somewhere where I could add a bit more value by doing something that other journalists hadn't already done or might not do in the future. And I had been in touch with the NMSP-AD for a while. We had done a couple articles for Frontier that were written by a Myanmar reporter, but which I edited. I guess the main questions that I had in mind were, what's the nature of the split between the NMSP and the NMSP-AD? How significant is it? Is there any tension between these two groups? Do they still have a relatively good relationship with each other? And then also, what's the NMSP AD's relationship with the KNU? Historically, the NMSP and the KNU have had a lot of problems between each other, territorial disputes. The NMSP has territory in Karen State, in Mon majority villages in Karen State. That's a source of tension, obviously. But now, after the coup, they seem to be cooperating a lot more than we would have seen in the past. And I think some people might feel like that's obviously what would happen, but that's not what we have been seeing in other parts of Myanmar. The military is proven to be very good at leveraging pre-existing ethno-religious tension. So we've seen the way that the military has gotten the PAO National Army on their side to fight against the KNDF in Karenni State. We've seen a similar thing with the Shani Nationalities Army fighting against the Kachin Independence Army in Kachin-Sagaing border area. And then, of course, the Rohingya and the Rakhine armed groups fighting against each other. So I think it's actually quite significant that the NMSP has managed to resist that tension, resist that kind of appeal from the military. Why don't you defend your villages from the KNU and the PDFs? They're encroaching on your territory. You'll get some political benefit if you help us against them, and they've really resisted that. So I thought that was interesting.
Right, and one reason why there haven't been foreign journalist dispatches from NMSP areas is that in this post-coup environment, getting there isn't easy. You needed to rely on cooperation from the Karen National Union for the trip, and you stayed for some of your time, quite far from the Thailand border in Mudon Township. So how did you get there?
I mean, we crossed the border in Karen State, right? In the Payathonzu area, so in Chayin Segji Township. And the NMSP does control territory along the border there. But then we do have to drive through a very extensive area that is primarily a mixture of Karen groups. I mean, we'd see KNU checkpoints. We'd see areas that were controlled by the Karen State BGF, the DKBA. And then you get to another area that's controlled by the NMSP AD. And in these chunks of territory in Karen State that are controlled by the NMSP AD, they've been controlled by the NMSP for decades. They were recognized in the 1995 ceasefire between the NMSP and the Myanmar military at the time. So they're quite stable territorial enclaves that have, their own parallel administration and have for a very, very long time. And from this kind of stable, controlled area in Karen State, they're launching attacks into Mon State. So I visited a couple frontline camps in Mudon and Chekmara Township in Mon State, where they're kind of focusing on expanding their territory into Mon State at the moment. And basically what they're doing, it's more similar to what other groups were doing at the very early stage of the conflict, right? Because they're almost like a couple of years behind. So they're ambushing the military anytime they leave their bases, anytime they try to use the highway or anything like that. So they're keeping them pinned in their bases. And then with the soldiers not leaving their bases, they can go into these villages and kind of expand their influence more and more. And it sounds like, I mean, again, I'm hearing this from the NMSP AD, so everything with a grain of salt, but they also claim that the villagers in these areas are very sympathetic to their cause, and that makes it a lot easier for them to accomplish this, because the villagers themselves are kind of tipping them off on the military's movements, and they're very receptive to the NMSP AD kind of coming in and supplanting the military administration with their own.
All right, we've covered here, how the NMSP is split, how the split was on political grounds. But in practice, of course, this had to mean splitting actual grounds, like territory. So which areas does the NMSP AD control now? What did the NMSP split mean for, territorial control and influence in Mon and Karen states between these groups?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there was some kind of confusion in the media in terms of how the splits happen, and we saw some articles, I think including even former Frontier articles, where people used the term battalion. Um and I think that's because that's what we're used to when we talk to groups like the KNU, and they talk about brigades and battalions and stuff like that. But actually, when I was meeting and speaking to the NMSP, they were talking about it in terms of military regions. Um, and so they have like a number 7 or 8 military regions, and they're kind of these enclaves of territory that aren't contiguous. So you have like one here, one there, and there's a lot of space in between them. And these are the areas that were recognized in the 1995 ceasefire. So they're a bit scattered in that way. So yeah, you've had 2 military regions that defected en masse to the NMSP-AD. And what that means is that like you have not just a battalion of soldiers leaving, but you've lost an entire chunk of territory. And those territories include villages and schools and hospitals that are administered by the NMSP. And with the first defection in Chainsek-ji Township, it wasn't that dramatic, but the second military region that defected was the Payathonzu region, and that's on the border, directly on the border with Thailand, and is an area with a lot of business, economic opportunities. Obviously, border areas are always trade areas. And where I was told a lot of senior NMSP officials have their like primary residences. So you've now got a situation where like the leaders of the NMSP potentially could not go to their own homes. But obviously they worked out a kind of agreement where they could still access this territory. But I was told that was the kind of high watermark of the tension between the two groups, that otherwise they've managed to maintain pretty good relations. But when the Payathonzu group split, that was a real kind of seismic event that threatened the equilibrium the two groups have managed to maintain.
Okay, thanks. On the note about these areas of the NMSP and the NMSP-AD, these areas being non-contiguous, right? The areas they control. How would you then characterize how conflict works there? You reported before on ammunition shortages in Karen State, the resistance groups there, and how that really limited their operations. So are these shortages even more acute in Mon State, being a little bit more removed from the Thailand border in general? But then you also mention in your upcoming article that the NMSP, when they signed that first ceasefire, 30 years ago, and then the other ones, they actually didn't disarm. So could the NMSP-AD just pick up the guns they already had and sort of get stuck right in? And where do they get the guns from?
Yeah, I mean, I think the NMSP are suffering from the same ammunition shortage that the KNU are. My understanding is that these two groups defected en masse. They brought their weapons. They're still in the same territory. They just declared that they're joining the revolution, essentially. And then they're also open to any individuals or units who want to defect. I think the bigger issue is that after they announced the split, or that they were joining the revolution, they were overwhelmed with like a surge of new recruits, which is something that we've seen happen everywhere. So there were many young Mon people who wanted to join the revolution, but were kind of waiting to see what the NMSP would do. And then once the NMSP joined, they were like, all right, we're ready. We want to fight. And they were like, actually, we don't have enough guns for all of you, which is something we've heard everywhere. I mean, even the KNDF, I think, had about half as many guns as they had fighters when I was there about a year ago. So that's a common problem. There's just always been more people willing to fight than the weapons availability. I think one thing that is to the NMSP's advantage, at least at the moment, is that, as I said before, they're in a kind of earlier stage of the conflict. They're not at the stage that the KNU and the KNDF are at, where they're trying to seize towns and when they're trying to seize control of like major stretches of territory and essentially liberate a state. They're still at the very early stage where they're waging a kind of guerrilla warfare. So they don't need the same level of weaponry that those other groups need, because they're still effectively like ambushing soldiers on the highway, pinning them down in their bases, that kind of thing. I mean, I guess it could be a barrier to them evolving to the next stage of conflict if they don't manage to get a better source of weapons and ammunition. And I think that's going to be a continuous problem for really all of these groups, because it seems like Thailand and China are really turning the screws on ammunition access, with the intention of trying to force a kind of ceasefire. So,
all right, we're getting a little bit strategic there. So let's think about the NMSP, the strategic implications of their small attacks, the pressure being brought to bear. You know, there are major Myanmar military operations still going on nearby, the Aung Zaea column, and maybe you didn't hear it from Mun people directly, maybe you heard it from Karen fighters. But what do you think, what have the consequences been from these NMSP AD guerrilla attacks in areas that the Sittdat, is used to patrolling?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a clear strategic benefit in terms of overstretching the military, right? You have like a new front opening, basically, in Mon State that the military has to pay attention to. And to that effect, the KNU is very much involved. What I was told is that a lot of the military operations in these areas are joint operations. Typically, if they take place in a Karen area, they're led by the KNU with the NMSP AD in support. And if they're taking place in Mon areas, they're led by the NMSP AD with the KNU in support. I mean, this is what AD told me. I think at the moment, KNU just has a lot more experience. Obviously, the NMSP has been around for a really, really, really long time, but they also haven't engaged in much fighting in a really long time. At least not, large scale fighting. So to a certain extent, I think the KNU is probably providing a kind of elder brother role of sorts, which the NMSP might not be happy to hear it characterized that way, but it's just a kind of basic necessity in terms of battlefield experience. And interestingly enough, I mean, a lot of the smaller Mon militias that formed after the coup have more battlefield experience than a lot of the NMSP AD fighters. They don't have territory that they control, and they don't have the experience like running an administration or a coherent kind of chain of commands that the NMSP does, but they have the actual battlefield experience that a lot of people in the NMSP don't have. Although they're starting to get it, because now it's been like a year since they entered the fold. So,
right, you've mentioned how venerable the NMSP is, its lack of recent combat experience, especially compared to the post-coup armed groups. It makes me think of the NMSP AD's capacity to sort of do what's needed these days to fight the military. I'm thinking about drones in particular, which are the real post-coup arms race. And other Mun groups, like the Mun Liberation Army, are using drones. They had a major successful attack this week. Did you see or talk about drone warfare while you were there?
No, yeah, nothing about drones really came up. I mean, it definitely seemed to be something more on the KNU PDF side. I didn't hear much about drones. It also seemed like the military in general hadn't started to take this theater of the conflict too seriously yet. So, like, they know where the NMSP AD base is located because it was, as part of the terms of the ceasefire. They know where the main hospital is located, and they haven't done any airstrikes on these facilities yet. And they're kind of living on the edge, knowing that it could happen at any moment, but it hasn't yet. So I think there's a degree as well to which the military is forced to prioritize different conflict theaters because it just doesn't have enough technology, ammunition to go around. And so at the moment, I think the Mon theater is relatively low on the list of priorities. But then obviously the danger of that is that once you start paying attention to it, it could have kind of escalated to a point where it's now a serious problem.
All right. Well, you've mentioned ammunition, battlefield experience, and then the threat to civilians. So are there any other which of these are the major concerns for the NMSP AD going forward? And where do you think they want to be in, say, a year's time from now?
Yeah, I mean, I think their hope is to have claimed some more significant chunks of Mon State in a year. I think their concerns are primarily civilian, the risk to civilians. Like I think anybody who's been following this has heard the NMSP talk a lot about the risk to civilians as a kind of justification for not joining the revolution initially. And I think from afar, it can sound kind of like a cop out, like an excuse. But when you go there and you kind of see what their territory looks like, it makes a lot more sense. I mean, I visited a group of like 37 villages, and these are places with paved roads, well-built homes made of brick and hardwood, satellite dishes, electronic stores and Thai restaurants. All this stuff is kind of mentioned in the Frontier article. But it feels like very developed compared to these rural areas that I visited in Karenni State and Karen State. I mean, the area of Demoso that the KNDF controls is like one giant IDB camp. Like every single home is made of tarp and flimsy wood and stuff like that. It feels very impermanent, very undeveloped. And the NMSP territory, it felt the opposite. I was kind of shocked by how well developed it was. So I think their primary concern is like, how do we expand our territory without inviting a kind of retribution on these areas, airstrikes, artillery attacks, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and how to do that. Well, you go into detail in your feature story. You've also said a little bit today about the NMSPAD's cooperation with the Karen National Union. But I want to know, what did the NMSPAD say to you about working with the other groups like People's Defence Forces, the other post-coup Mun revolutionary forces, and that cooperation?
I don't think there's necessarily a ton of cooperation with PDFs that are, loyal to the national unity government. I didn't hear much about cooperation there. Cooperation with post-coup Mon militias is definitely something that's going on, like the Mon Liberation Army, the Mon State Defense Force, and I think there's one other. But they're trying to integrate their forces effectively into one chain of command. And at the moment, they're doing a kind of trial period where they've formed one column with a certain number of soldiers taken from each group, and the senior most officers from NMSP AD. But there's still some things that they've got to work out. I mean, some of these groups belong to various consultative councils, and the NMSP AD is extremely skeptical of these consultative councils. They basically see them, the NMSP sees itself as the only kind of Mon administration that is needed, and the only one that actually controls territories. They have like a Mon State Federal Council and a Mon State Consultative Council or something, but neither of them control any significant territory. So, I mean, the NMSP was quite dismissive of this, saying that they were like trying to create a government before they had territory, and that was kind of pointless, that you need to have territory to administer before you create an administration. And then on the other side, I think there's skepticism of the NMSP AD related to how long it took them to join the revolution. And I think that's kind of multifaceted. I think there's a lot of just general resentment in Myanmar towards people who didn't join the revolution early enough, in a way that I often think is counterproductive. This kind of desire to punish people or ostracize people who like didn't join the revolution early enough. But I think some of it could be warranted in the case of the NMSP AD, because there is this kind of question of how genuinely committed to the revolution they are. There was a question of like, did they just join the revolution because the KNU and the PDFs were getting so powerful, and they were worried that if they like sat out the revolution, they wouldn't share in the spoils after the military falls or something like that. And the NMSP AD leadership that I spoke to denied that that was a motivation, but then like lower ranking people would confirm that that was a motivation. So I think at the moment right now in Myanmar, there's this sense that you have to fight for your political rights. They're not just going to be given to you after the military is defeated. So I think some of the post-coup groups are a little bit skeptical of how genuinely committed they are to the revolution. But the integration seems to be going ahead. And after this trial period, we'll probably have a clearer idea of where they stand. I mean, the leader of the Mon Liberation Army was very adamant about this merger going forward. It's actually more about convincing the kind of rank and file soldiers to go along with it. So,
Okay. Now, thinking forward, as the NMSP AD changes over time, how tenable is this situation, the status quo, where it sits within the same structure and organization as the NMSP, which is still towing the line of the Myanmar military, its coup, and its ongoing atrocities? You know, every time there's a development in the local conflict scenario, the relationships within the NMSP must be tested, right? So are they both on still parallel tracks, or are these tracks ever so slightly going in different directions and the gulf widening?
yeah, no, I think that's a good characterization and a good question. We're in this kind of liminal state right now where it feels like this can't hold forever. The split initially was relatively kind of cosmetic. There was an idea that the NMSP parent organization could kind of continue running public services while AD focused on fighting. Because of how kind of disparate the territories are, that doesn't really work ultimately. So already we're seeing it move apart a little bit more because AD has had to take over administering some things that they didn't plan on, like they're like running the hospital and, you know, elements of the judicial system and stuff like that they initially thought they could just kind of leave to the NMSP. So yeah, I do think there will probably come a kind of inflection point where the parent organization either joins the revolution or the split becomes much more tangible. I guess the only way that to avoid that would be if the military were to like collapse in the very near future. But then you'd see a kind of re-merging of the NMSP anyway, I would imagine. So yeah, it does feel like we're in this kind of strange liminal space that can't continue forever. And yeah, the more that the NMSP AD incorporates new groups into its chain of command, the more kind of new territory it seizes. And particularly if the military starts fighting back in earnest. Because at the moment, I would say that the Mon State front, like I said earlier, is very low priority and the military is not focusing on it. But if it starts really hammering them, then that's also going to be a real inflection point. Because will the parent organization help AD if they're under a lot of pressure? Or will they just kind of say, you chose this path, you deal with the consequences now? Because that's another thing where it feels like this kind of liminal space can't continue. I think AD would be understandably pretty hurt if the parent organization didn't support them during that time. But also this is what NMSP has warned about from the beginning, is if you get involved in the conflict, then like there's going to be retaliation and Mon civilians are going to suffer. And so far, I mean, we've seen that a bit. There's been some villages in Chekmara that have been quite badly punished. But for the most part, on the scale of, you know, what we've seen in other conflict theaters, it hasn't reached that same level yet.
Look, thanks so much for your reports, Andy. I want to encourage everyone again to check the Frontier website early next week to have a read of your feature story. Before we sign off, though, do you have any other observations? You know, what was the trip like as a journalist, as a traveler? I know that you write in your story that you enjoyed the Tanyi, the toddy wine. What else stuck with you?
Yeah. I mean, it was a really great trip, I would say. I mean, I have a couple kind of offhand observations that I think would be interesting. For starters, everyone spoke the Mon language. I basically didn't hear Burmese spoken the whole time that I was with the NMSP. And that was not the case on my other cross-border trips. In Karenni State, mostly people spoke Burmese. In Karen State, it was maybe 50-50. In NMSP territory, it was exclusively Mon. A lot of people spoke Thai as well, which again was not the case in Karenni State. And I speak pretty advanced Thai now, so I was able to communicate a lot with people on my own, not through a translator, which was something that I wasn't able to do as much in Karen and Karenni State as well. I mean, everywhere there's a certain percentage of people who speak English, but it was nice to be able to communicate with people in Thai and not have to depend on a translator all the time. It was a very, very welcoming community, although that's been basically the same everywhere that I've gone. It like came up that I liked mohinga, and then every day when I woke up at the base, there was like a bowl of mohinga waiting for me that they had to go get from one of the villages.